Alright, so now that we have spark where it should be and it's starting better, I did also mention I wanted to take a look at the compression of the engine, as hard starting can be an indicator of low compression in an engine. It obviously started a lot better after I replaced the points, but I want to make sure that the compression is where it should be or can be. And I did mention the other thing is that every so often when it was running, I'd hear kind of like a puff, 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 puff from the exhaust. And from what I know, that kind of indicates that I could potentially have the exhaust valve hanging up. And so I just want to make sure that the exhaust valve and both valves and everything is sealing the way it should. It's pretty common for these older engines, especially with adjustable carbs, if they run a little bit too rich or if they accumulate enough hours, that the exhaust valves can kind of have some carbon, and maybe the exhaust valve seat and face just need a little bit of work. I won't know that. I could tear into it, just tear it down and do it. But I thought I would just go ahead and start with a compression check and go from there to see if it's worth even tearing down to do it. So let me get you guys set up so you can see the engine better for compression testing, and we'll get into it. Alright, so first things first, I've got my speed selector lever down in the stop position, so it's going to disable spark. And then I'm going to take a screwdriver and I'm going to go ahead and rest it right in there. Prop the throttle open, make sure the choke is open. Oops, move my screwdriver. I want that kind of sitting there. It should be able to just kind of sit there and hold the throttle open so that when I do the compression testing, I don't have very many restrictions to the airflow going into the engine. And then I'm going to come here and remove my spark plug once again. We'll go ahead and thread in our compression tester. Just hold the tube straight, spin it in. And we'll see if I can maybe hold that so you guys can see it while I pull it over. And I'm going to pull it over at least 3 pulls, more than 4. And I want to see how high this gets. On an older engine like this, I would like to see at least 70 psi. But we'll see what we get. And I've got almost 100 psi. So that's actually pretty good. But let's take this a step further. Let's go ahead and do a quick wet test and see if that gets any better. So we'll dump the pressure, we'll take the hose out. I've got a oil bottle cap full of oil, and I've even got a small funnel here to kind of make sure that I don't spill it everywhere. I'm going to put just a little bit of oil, this is 5W30, into the cylinder with the idea is that this is going to help the rings form a better seal. And if my compression gets better, that means that the rings were contributing to the lower compression values, although 90 wasn't bad. And if there's no improvement, then that means that we want to take a look at the valves. I'm going to slowly pull the engine over to allow the oil to circulate and get on the rings and the cylinder walls. And then now we're going to reinstall our compression gauge. We're going to retest. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. See that clearly. And we got to do the same number of pulls, which was 3. And you can see here, we're up to about 110 now. So the oil did help the rings, and we had, I don't know, approximate 10 psi gain. So that's a pretty good gain, but pretty marginal for the rings too, though. So 110 would be pretty satisfactory for an engine as old as this is. I still want to just know if my valves are fully sealing or not. So we're going to go ahead and do a cylinder leak down test anyway. So in order to prep for the cylinder leak down test, I no longer need to have my throttle propped. But what I do need to do is to get a cylinder leak down tester gauge, air hose for shop air, and I'm going to need to find top dead center of the compression stroke. So I'm going to need a light so I can look into the spark plug hole and identify when the piston's at top dead center. So let me go grab some more testing equipment. I'll be right back. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to want to do is I'm going to need to be able to lock the engine into position. And a lot of times on machines like these, I end up putting a vice grip on the output of the crankshaft. So I'm going to go ahead and pull the cover for the belts. And I'll probably put a vice grips right here. And then I'm going to take a light. I'm going to shine it in here into the spark plug hole. I'm going to slowly pull the engine over until I see the piston up near the top dead center. And then I'm going to take a look at the valves. I'm going to grab the crank and I'm going to go back and forth with it to see if the valves open and close or move up and down because they're in valve overlap. Right now I'm moving the crank back and forth, but the valves aren't moving. So that indicates to me that my piston is up near top dead center on the compression stroke. And so I'm going to try to find that middle point between where the piston rises and falls. And this is where I'm going to try to clamp it off. Alright, so now that I have my engine in position, I want to lock it in place. So I'm going to take a pair of vice grips and I am going to clamp it onto the crankshaft. Be careful not to hit the seal, but I'm going to have the vice grips hit one of the bolts that holds this belt guide on, so that way when I go to fill air pressure into the cylinder and the engine might want to rotate, that it hits the bolt and doesn't. Okay. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the hose for the cylinder leak down tester. Thread it into the spark plug hole. Just by hand, that's all I need. Then I'm going to let that rest right there for right now. I'm going to make sure my dipstick is loose so that any blow-by gases past the piston can come out through here. And then I've got my cylinder leak down gauge. And I'm going to go ahead and hook up shop air to the cylinder leak down tester. And then I'm going to crank up the pressure to about 100 psi or to where my needle is close to set. It looks like my line pressure is down a little bit, probably because the air compressor hasn't kicked on for a while. So I'm sitting at 90. I'm pretty close to the set. At the very least, I can still put air into the cylinder and know whether or not my valves are sealing, which right now is my primary concern. So now that I've got air pressure, I'm just going to slowly and carefully hook up my line to my tester. Okay, so I got my tester hooked up now. We're putting air into the cylinder. You can see that my needle is showing approximately 20% leakage, which, if that's all past the piston rings, would be marginally acceptable. So I can check the dipstick. This would be leakage past the rings through the crankcase. Not really a lot of air there. If I check my muffler, maybe you can hear that, but I got air coming out right out my exhaust valve. And then I can check the carburetor. My choke is still open. Don't really feel anything coming out of the intake. And then I can feel around the cylinder head gasket area where the cylinder head bolts to the block. And I don't think I feel anything there. Now the one thing about this is we have to be aware of the compression release mechanism for engines that are equipped with it. Depending on the engine and where that compression release mechanism is designed to dump off compression, which is usually pretty close to top dead center, I have to make sure that I haven't locked the engine in on a spot where there's compression release. So I'm going to try to see if I can move my vice grips and rotate my engine. And I'm going to just move it. I'm going to take the air pressure off so I can rotate it safely. And I'm going to set this down. And I'm going to allow the engine to rotate. When I let go of the vice grips, it rotated a little bit. And then I'm going to relock it in position, so now it should be still near top dead center, but hopefully no longer at compression release, and so I'm going to retest. Okay, so now I've got a lot of leakage, so I might have moved a little bit too far. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to back this off. And I know I was on top dead center of the compression stroke before. And set the gauge off to the side. I'm going to reset my engine, and then I'm going to change the way I lock the engine out so that I can move it a little bit better. So we'll come back in here. Yeah, the piston was only about a half an inch down from top dead center. Alright, so now that we're at TDC, go back and forth. I don't see the valves moving. I'm going to put it just a little bit after there. And then we will reinstall our hose. And then I'm going to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the vice grips on the bigger part of the pulley here so that I can possibly grab hold of it. Just maybe manually hold it in place. Hopefully I got enough arm strength to do that. Make sure your regulator's backed off for this so it doesn't move suddenly. We'll rehook this up. Okay. And then, so I'm going to set this here so you guys can hopefully you can see that, and I can hold this. And we're going to turn this clockwise. Okay, it's getting pretty hard to turn. But I can move it one way or the other. And the airflow doesn't stop. So I know I can move it far enough that it's no longer on the compression release. But the airflow never really stops. So that's a pretty clear indication that the exhaust valve is leaking. And it's going to need some attention. So, with that conclusion, we can disconnect our tester for the final time. Set that off to the side. And now we know that the cylinder head and the muffler, probably the engine shroud, are going to need to come off so that we can service the valve. Probably just needs to be cleaned and lapped. So we'll get into it. Time to go get some more service tools for doing a valve lapping on this L-head here. Alright, let's get into it. Normally I'd probably just try to pull the cylinder head, the muffler, and the intake. But for clarity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and pull the cover back off for the shroud. So that means that the starter's got to get loosened. Loosen that up so that the shroud will be able to slip past it. And we got to pull the shroud bolt. And then we got to move to the other side. Set that off to the side. Oh, this came out quite easy. Pull the governor spring off before we try to move the carb so that way we don't stretch it. And we got to release that fuel line yet too. And the primer hose has to come back off yet again. I am working over the top of cardboard, so any fuel that spills is getting soaked up by cardboard. Intake or exhaust intake here. Let's get that valve box cover off next. It's stuck on there pretty good. I guess we'll probably be putting a new gasket on this one here. That was a short one. Remember that position. This one's got a special head. Remember this position. This one's got a washer on it. Remember that position. This one's got a spacer underneath it. Of course, always have to pull heads with engines and full tanks of gas. So what we'll do is we'll take and we'll move the head out of the way. Not totally lose our spacer here. And then we'll take our bolt. Put this back to hold the gas tank up and in place while we service the valves. And I'll take my cylinder head and I'll put my bolts in where they came from. Make sure to keep track of spacers so that we can clean that up and get that all put back together the way it ought to be. Let me move you guys and we will have a closer look at those valves. You can see the intake on the left and the exhaust on the right there, and the carbon buildup inside the, or on top of the piston. Overall, it looks pretty good. Not bad. You can see there's some light cross hatching left on the cylinder wall. So that's good.
Not much of a ring ridge. Plenty of carbon to clean out though. You see the exhaust valve stem is pretty black. Need to be replacing the valve box cover gasket. That one tore. Sealed quite nicely though. Alright, well let's get these valves out.